I was standing in my kitchen drinking my morning coffee when I looked out the window and saw nothing but mud where my pond used to be. My 2-acre pond, stocked with over 300 koi, bass, and ornamental goldfish, had been completely drained overnight. My heart dropped into my stomach as I ran outside in my slippers, still holding the coffee mug, staring at what looked like a disaster zone on my own property. The pond had been my pride and joy since I bought this property in Asheville, North Carolina 3 years ago. I had spent thousands of dollars restoring it, stocking it with fish, installing proper filtration systems, and creating a small ecosystem that attracted herons, turtles, and all kinds of wildlife. Now it was just a crater of mud with hundreds of fish flopping desperately in shallow puddles, dying in the morning sun. I immediately started running back and forth with buckets, trying to save whatever fish I could, throwing them into the small holding tanks I kept in my garage for maintenance purposes. My hands were shaking, covered in mud and fish slime, as I watched thousands of dollars worth of livestock suffocating in front of me. I managed to save maybe 20 fish before I realized it was hopeless. The rest were already dead or too far gone. That was when I noticed the industrial pump sitting at the edge of my property line. It was one of those massive diesel-powered units that contractors use for dewatering construction sites. Someone had deliberately set it up, run hoses into my pond, and pumped it completely dry. This was not an accident. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of everything: the dead fish, the pump, the mud, all of it. My hands were still trembling with rage and shock as I documented the scene. Then I saw the notice. It was stuck to a stake that had been driven into the ground near where the pump sat. A printed letter on official HOA letterhead from the Pine Valley Homeowners Association. I ripped it off the stake and read it, my blood pressure rising with every word. Notice of violation and corrective action. Dear property owner, the Pine Valley HOA has received multiple complaints regarding the standing water feature on your property at 1847 Meadowbrook Lane. Per HOA Regulations, Section 12.4, all water features must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee prior to installation. As you failed to obtain proper approval, and as the pond constitutes a potential mosquito breeding ground and liability hazard, the HOA has taken corrective action to drain the water feature. You have 30 days to fill in the depression and restore the property to its original grade. Failure to comply will result in daily fines of $200. Sincerely, Patricia Wembley, HOA President. I read it 3 times, each time getting angrier. Patricia Wembley, I knew that name. She was the woman who had moved into the neighborhood about 8 months ago and immediately started running for HOA president. She won by default because nobody else wanted the job, and she had been on a power trip ever since. She had sent me 2 previous letters about my pond, both of which I had ignored because my property was not part of her HOA. That was the key detail Patricia seemed to have missed. When I bought this property, I specifically made sure it was not part of any HOA. The previous owner had purchased the land back in 1987, before the Pine Valley development even existed. My 2-acre lot was grandfathered in, completely independent of the HOA that had been established in 1995 when they started building the neighborhood around my property. I had the deed, the title report, and a letter from a real estate attorney confirming that my property was not subject to any HOA rules or regulations. I'd shown Patricia this documentation twice before when she tried to cite me for other supposed violations. She had backed off both times, but apparently she decided to escalate things. I called the police immediately. The Henderson County Sheriff's Department sent a deputy out within 30 minutes. Deputy Rodriguez was a young guy, maybe late 20s, and he looked genuinely shocked when he saw the destruction. So let me get this straight, he said, taking notes. You own this property, it is not part of the HOA, and they came onto your land without permission and did this. Exactly, I said, showing him the notice. I have all the documentation proving my property is not subject to their authority. They have trespassed, destroyed my property, and killed hundreds of my fish. Deputy Rodriguez took photos and wrote up a report. This is definitely criminal trespassing and property destruction. The fish would probably fall under livestock destruction laws since they were being raised on your property. You are talking about potentially serious charges. I want to press charges. Or, I said firmly. All of them, the deputy nodded. I will need to speak with this Patricia Wembley and anyone else involved. Do you know who actually did the physical work of draining the pond? I shook my head. It had to have happened last night. I checked on the pond around 9 p.m. and everything was fine. I woke up at 7 this morning and it was empty. That pump probably ran for 8 to 10 hours. We will investigate, Deputy Rodriguez assured me. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, videos, make a list of all your losses with whatever documentation you have for the value of the fish and the cost to restore the pond. After the deputy left, I spent the rest of the day doing exactly that. I went through my records and found receipts for every fish I had purchased over the past 3 years. The 40 koi alone represented over $12,000. I had bought them from a specialty breeder in Virginia, and some of the larger specimens were worth $1,000 each. The bass I had stocked for fishing were another $2,000 from a fish hatchery in Tennessee. The ornamental goldfish, turtles, and the entire ecosystem I had built represented years of work and tens of thousands of dollars in investment. I also called my insurance company, only to discover that my homeowners policy had a specific exclusion for livestock and fish. They were considered agricultural property and would need separate coverage that I did not have. That meant I was on my own for recovering damages. By the end of the day, I had compiled a detailed invoice. The fish stock alone came to $38,000. The damage to the pond infrastructure, including destroyed filters, damaged liner, ruined plants, and the cost of repairs, added another $15,000. The cost of my time for 3 years of pond maintenance and management at a reasonable hourly rate brought it to $55,000. I added the cost of having to rent equipment to properly refill and repair the pond, plus the replacement cost of the ecosystem I had built, bringing the total to $72,000. I printed out the invoice on official-looking letterhead I made on my computer, attached copies of all my receipts and documentation, and hand-delivered it to Patricia Wembley's house that evening. She lived 4 houses down in a pristine beige house with a perfectly manicured lawn and decorative flags hanging from the porch. I rang the doorbell and waited. When she opened the door, I recognized her immediately from the HOA meetings she'd tried to make me attend. Patricia Wembley was exactly what you would expect. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in that specific suburban mom style, wearing white capri pants and a pastel pink polo shirt. She had that look of permanent disapproval on her face, like she was constantly smelling something unpleasant. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone already hostile. "I am Jake Morrison from 1847 Meadowbrook Lane," I said calmly, holding up the invoice. "I am here to deliver a bill for the damage your HOA caused to my property." Her eyes narrowed. "I do not know what you are talking about. Your organization drained my pond without permission, trespassed on my property, and destroyed over $30,000 worth of fish stock. This invoice is for $72,000 in damages due within 30 days. Patricia actually laughed. That ridiculous pond was a violation of community standards. We had every right to take corrective action. "No, you did not," I said, keeping my voice level. "My property is not part of your HOA. I have shown you the documentation multiple times. You had no authority to set foot on my land, and what you did constitutes criminal trespassing and property destruction. The sheriff's department is investigating, and I am pursuing both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit." Her face went red. "Your property may not technically be part of the HOA, but it is surrounded by our community, and your actions affect our property values. That pond was an eyesore and a hazard." "That's not your decision to make," I said. "You committed crimes on my property. This invoice represents the minimum of what you owe me. I suggest you contact your HOA insurance and legal team immediately, because this is not going away." I handed her the invoice and walked away before she could respond. I could hear her sputtering behind me, but I did not turn around. The next morning, I called a lawyer. I found a firm in Asheville that specialized in property disputes and HOA issues. The attorney I met with, Daniel Chen, listened to my story and examined all my documentation with growing interest. "This is one of the most clear-cut cases I have seen," he said. "They committed multiple crimes and civil violations, trespassing, property destruction, potentially even theft since they stole the water from your pond. The fact that you have documentation proving your property is not subject to the HOA makes their actions completely indefensible. What are my options? I asked. We file a civil lawsuit for damages, and you continue pursuing criminal charges through the sheriff's department. In cases like this, the HOA's insurance will likely want to settle quickly to avoid a trial. The problem for them is that their actions were so egregious and premeditated that insurance might not even cover it. Intentional acts are often excluded from liability policies. Good, I said. I want them to feel the consequences of what they did. Daniel filed the lawsuit that week. We sued the Pine Valley HOA, Patricia Wembley personally, and anyone else involved in the decision to drain my pond. The lawsuit demanded $72,000 in direct damages, plus punitive damages, legal fees, and compensation for emotional distress. The response from the HOA came faster than I expected. 3 days after they were served with the lawsuit, I received a letter from their attorney offering to settle for $15,000 with no admission of wrongdoing. I called Daniel immediately. They offered $15,000. "That is insulting," he said. "We have documentation proving your fish alone were worth $38,000. We are not accepting anything less than full compensation plus punitive damages. Let me handle this." While the legal process moved forward, the criminal investigation was also progressing. Deputy Rodriguez came by my property again with a detective named Sarah Williams. They had been doing interviews and gathering evidence. "We've identified who actually operated the pump," Detective Williams told me. "It was a landscaping company called Green Meadows Lawn Care. They were hired by the HOA and paid $800 to drain your pond. The owner of the company, Frank Morrison, claims he was told by Patricia Wembley that the HOA had authority over your property and that the draining was authorized." "So they hired someone to do their dirty work," I said. "Exactly. But ignorance is not a defense here. Frank Morrison should have verified he had legal authority to enter your property and drain the pond. We are looking at charging him with criminal trespassing and property destruction as an accessory. The main charges will focus on Patricia Wembley and the HOA board members who approved this action." "How many board members are there?" I asked. 5 total. Patricia Wembley is president, then 4 others. We have been interviewing them, and it gets interesting here. 3 of the 4 other board members claim they never approved the pond draining. They say Patricia did it unilaterally without a vote. That was significant. "So she acted on her own?" "Possibly," Detective Williams said. "We are still investigating, but it looks like she might have exceeded her authority even within the HOA's own governance structure. That actually makes things worse for her personally." Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. The HOA's insurance company denied coverage for the incident, citing an exclusion for intentional acts. That meant the HOA and Patricia personally were on the hook for any damages. The HOA's attorney reached out to Daniel with a new settlement offer of $45,000. "We are getting closer," Daniel told me, "but I think we can do better. The fact that their insurance denied coverage means they are vulnerable. They are looking at potentially catastrophic damages if this goes to trial." Meanwhile, word had spread through the neighborhood about what happened. Most of my neighbors were actually sympathetic to me, not to Patricia. Several of them came by to express their outrage at what the HOA had done. One neighbor, an older man named Robert Chen, who lived 2 houses down, knocked on my door one evening with some interesting information. "I thought you should know," Robert said. "There is a special meeting of the HOA tomorrow night. A bunch of us have been organizing to remove Patricia from the board. What she did to you was the last straw. She has been abusing her position for months, harassing people over minor violations, trying to fine people for absurd things. We have enough votes to remove her." "I appreciate that," I said, "though I'm not sure it helps my legal situation." "It might," Robert said. "If the HOA removes her and acknowledges that she acted without authority, that could help with your lawsuit. The HOA itself might be less liable if they can show she went rogue." He had a point. I attended the HOA meeting the next night, even though I was not a member. It was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About 40 people showed up, which Robert told me was 3 times the normal attendance. Patricia stood at the front of the room looking defiant as Robert called the meeting to order. He had apparently invoked some provision in the HOA bylaws to call a special meeting and vote on removing board members for cause. "We are here tonight because President Wembley has engaged in conduct that is harmful to this community," Robert announced. "She unilaterally authorized the destruction of property belonging to Jake Morrison, whose land is not even subject to this HOA. Her actions have exposed all of us to legal liability. The lawsuit currently filed against our HOA could bankrupt our reserves and force us to levy special assessments on every homeowner here." That got people's attention. Homeowners started murmuring and looking worried. Patricia stood up, her face flushed. "I was acting to protect our property values. That pond was a blight on our community." "The pond was on private property that you have no authority over," Robert shot back. "You committed crimes. You trespassed, destroyed property, and killed hundreds of fish. The police are investigating criminal charges against you." "I was protecting this community," Patricia insisted, her voice rising. "All of you benefit from me enforcing standards, even if I have to make tough decisions." Another homeowner, a woman named Lisa, stood up. "You have been harassing everyone for months, Patricia. You tried to fine me because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. You sent my neighbor a violation notice because his Christmas lights were up 2 days past your arbitrary deadline. You are on a power trip, and now your actions are going to cost all of us money." The meeting got heated after that. People started sharing their own stories of Patricia's overreach. It became clear that she had made herself very unpopular by being overly aggressive in enforcing HOA rules, even trying to enforce them against properties that were not part of the association. When the vote finally came, it was overwhelming. 37 homeowners voted to remove Patricia Wembley from the HOA board with only 3 votes in her favor. She was out. Patricia stood there looking stunned. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the community center, slamming the door behind her. The remaining board members immediately voted to elect Robert as the new president. After the meeting, Robert approached me. "We want to make this right. The new board is going to meet with our attorney and discuss how to handle your lawsuit. We acknowledge that what happened was wrong." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I still have $72,000 in damages." "We understand. Let us talk to our lawyer and see what we can work out." 2 days later, Daniel called me with an update. The HOA has offered a new settlement. They are willing to pay $65,000, plus a formal written apology and an acknowledgement that your property is not subject to HOA authority. They will also agree to a permanent injunction preventing them from ever claiming jurisdiction over your property. I thought about it. What about Patricia personally? She is the one who actually did this. The criminal investigation is still ongoing. The HOA is trying to separate themselves from her actions. They are claiming she acted outside her authority, which actually helps our case against her personally. We could reject this offer and go to trial, potentially get more from her individually, but that could take years, and there is no guarantee she has the assets to pay a large judgment. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "I recommend we accept the $65,000 from the HOA, and we continue pursuing Patricia personally for the remaining $7,000 plus additional punitive damages. We also let the criminal process play out. She could end up with a criminal record and potentially jail time." It made sense. I agreed to the settlement terms. We finalized the agreement a week later. The HOA paid me $65,000, issued a formal written apology that was sent to every homeowner in the community, and signed a permanent agreement acknowledging my property's independence from their authority. With that money, I was able to begin restoring my pond. I hired a professional pond restoration company out of Charlotte that specialized in repairing damaged water features. They spent 3 weeks repairing the liner, replacing the filtration systems, and refilling the pond. The cost came to about $18,000, which was actually less than I'd estimated. I also started the process of restocking the fish. I contacted the same koi breeder in Virginia and ordered 20 new koi to start rebuilding my collection. I bought new bass from the hatchery in Tennessee, and I ordered ornamental goldfish from a specialty supplier in Florida. It would take years to fully restore what I had lost, but I was making progress. Meanwhile, the criminal case against Patricia continued. Detective Williams kept me updated on the progress. The district attorney had decided to file charges of criminal trespassing, property destruction, and unlawful interference with agricultural property. The last charge was interesting because North Carolina law classified fish raised on private property as agricultural livestock, which carried enhanced penalties. Patricia hired a criminal defense attorney and tried to fight the charges. Her lawyer argued that she genuinely believed she had authority over my property and that there was no criminal intent. The prosecutor was not buying it. She was shown documentation multiple times proving she had no authority, the prosecutor told me during a meeting to discuss the case. She knew she was wrong and she did it anyway. That shows intent. We are not offering any plea deals that do not include restitution and probation at minimum. The case went to trial 4 months after the pond was drained. I was called as a witness and spent 2 hours on the stand describing what happened, showing photos of the dead fish, explaining the documentation I had provided to Patricia, and detailing the damage to my property. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that my fish were not really worth what I claimed, but I had receipts for everything. He tried to suggest that the pond was a public nuisance, but the prosecutor presented testimony from environmental experts explaining that properly maintained ponds are beneficial to local ecosystems. He tried to claim Patricia was just doing her duty as HOA president, but the prosecutor showed that she had acted outside her authority even within the HOA's own rules. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. During that hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement. I stood in the courtroom and looked directly at Patricia as I spoke. "What you did was not just illegal, it was cruel," I said. "You killed hundreds of living creatures because of your ego and your need for control. You destroyed something I spent years building because you could not stand the idea that someone was not subject to your authority. You showed no remorse, you never apologized, and you fought every step of the way instead of taking responsibility for your actions. I hope the court considers that when deciding your sentence." The judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Elizabeth Morrison. She looked at Patricia with clear disapproval. "Mrs. Wembley, your actions in this case demonstrate a disturbing disregard for property rights and the rule of law," Judge Morrison said. "You were repeatedly informed that you had no authority over Mr. Morrison's property, yet you chose to take matters into your own hands. You trespassed, destroyed property, and caused significant financial harm. Your lack of remorse throughout this process is troubling." The judge sentenced Patricia to 60 days in jail, suspended upon completion of 1 year of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, and restitution of $7,000 to cover the remaining damages from my lawsuit. Patricia also received a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. I also learned that the landscaping company owner, Frank Morrison, was separately charged with criminal trespassing. He pleaded guilty and received probation and a fine, though his penalties were lighter since he had been misled by Patricia about having authority. After the sentencing, I ran into Robert from the HOA in the parking lot outside the courthouse. He had attended the trial to show support. "Justice was served," he said. "What she did was wrong, and I am glad she is being held accountable." "How is the neighborhood doing?" I asked. "Much better," Robert said. "We have been restructuring the HOA to prevent this kind of abuse from happening again. We changed the bylaws to require board approval for any enforcement action over $1,000 in estimated costs. We are also creating a review process where homeowners can appeal violations. And we are being very careful to only enforce rules on properties that are actually subject to our authority." "That sounds like good changes," I said. "You inspired them," Robert replied. "What happened to you was a wake-up call. A lot of us had been uncomfortable with how Patricia was running things, but we did not push back until it went too far. We will do better." Over the following months, I focused on restoring my pond and getting back to normal life. The new fish were thriving and the ecosystem was slowly rebuilding itself. I installed security cameras around the property to make sure nobody ever tried anything like this again. Patricia completed her community service and stayed out of jail by complying with her probation terms. I heard through the neighborhood that she was trying to sell her house and move away, probably to escape the stigma of her criminal conviction. I did not feel sorry for her. I also took steps to protect myself legally going forward. I had my attorney draft and record documents with the county, making it crystal clear that my property was not subject to any HOA. I installed prominent signs at my property line stating that it was private property and not part of Pine Valley HOA. I wanted to make absolutely sure nobody could ever claim confusion about the status of my land. The pond restoration was completed about 6 months after the draining. It was not quite the same as before, as I had lost some truly unique koi that would be impossible to replace, but it was beautiful again. The water was clear, the fish were healthy, and the wildlife had returned. I often sat on my back porch in the evenings, watching the herons and turtles, listening to the bullfrogs, and feeling grateful that I had fought back. One evening, about 8 months after everything started, I was sitting on that porch when my phone rang. It was Daniel, my attorney. "I have some interesting news," he said. "Patricia Wembley has filed for bankruptcy. She is listing your restitution payment as one of her debts." "Can she do that?" I asked. "Criminal restitution usually cannot be discharged in bankruptcy, but she can try. I wanted to give you a heads up that you might need to file an objection with the bankruptcy court." I sighed. Even after losing in criminal court, she is still trying to avoid paying. "Some people never learn," Daniel said. "But do not worry. The bankruptcy judge is not going to let her discharge a criminal restitution order. It just might delay payment a bit." He was right. The bankruptcy judge ruled that Patricia's restitution obligation was non-dischargeable, meaning she still had to pay it even though her other debts were being forgiven. I eventually received a payment plan through the probation department, getting a few $100s a month until the full $7,000 was paid off. During this time, I became something of a local celebrity in property rights circles. A local news station did a story about my case, focusing on HOA, overreach, and the importance of knowing your property rights. I gave several interviews and even spoke at a county commissioner meeting about the need for stronger protections against aggressive HOAs. The publicity led to other homeowners reaching out to me with their own HOA horror stories. I heard from people who were being fined for absurd violations, people whose properties were being threatened with foreclosure over unpaid HOA dues, and people who were fighting against rules that seemed designed to harass rather than help. I started volunteering with a local property rights advocacy group, helping educate homeowners about their rights and connecting them with attorneys who could help. It felt good to turn my negative experience into something positive that could help others. Meanwhile, the Pine Valley HOA, under Robert's leadership, became a model for how community associations should operate. They focused on maintaining common areas and organizing community events rather than being the property police. Violation enforcement became rare and was handled with common sense rather than rigid adherence to every minor rule. I even developed a friendly relationship with many of my HOA neighbors, despite not being part of their association. They would invite me to community events, and I would share produce from my garden and occasionally let neighborhood kids fish in my pond under supervision. About a year after the initial incident, I was working on adding some new water plants to the pond when a car pulled up to my property. A woman in her 30s got out and approached me cautiously. "Are you Jake Morrison?" she asked. "That is me," I said, wiping mud off my hands. "My name is Jennifer Palmer. I live in a community about 30 miles from here, and I'm having problems with my HOA. I saw your story on the news and I was hoping you might be able to help me or at least point me in the right direction." I invited her to sit on my porch, and she told me her story. Her HOA was trying to fine her $5,000 for painting her front door a color they claimed violated community guidelines, even though multiple other houses had similar colored doors. It sounded like selective enforcement to me. Done. "The first thing you need to do is get a lawyer," I told her. "I can give you the name of the attorney who represented me. Second, document everything. Take photos of every other house with a similar door color. Get copies of all your HOA communications. Third, check your deed and title documents. Make absolutely sure your property is actually subject to the HOA and that they are following their own rules." I spent an hour talking with Jennifer, sharing everything I had learned from my experience. By the time she left, She seemed more confident about fighting back against her own HOA problems. That became a pattern. I helped dozens of people over the following year, always giving the same advice about documentation, legal representation, and standing up for property rights. Many of them won their cases or got their HOAs to back down. My pond continued to thrive. The koi grew larger and more beautiful. I added some rare varieties that I found through specialty breeders in California and Japan. The ecosystem became even more diverse than before, with native fish species naturally colonizing the pond from the nearby creek. I installed a small dock extending into the pond and started spending my evenings out there, fishing for bass and watching the sunset. It became my meditation spot, my place to decompress from the stress of work and life. Patricia eventually moved away from the neighborhood, selling her house at a loss according to the real estate gossip I heard. I never saw her again after the sentencing hearing, and that was fine with me. She had caused me significant stress and financial harm, but in the end, justice had been served. The criminal restitution was fully paid off about 18 months after the sentencing. I received the final payment and a letter from the probation department confirming that Patricia had completed all the terms of her sentence. Her probation was terminated, though her criminal record would remain. I took that final payment and used it to buy something I had been wanting, a pair of butterfly koi from a renowned breeder in Oregon. They were stunning fish with long, flowing fins that looked like wings as they swam through the water. They cost $3,000 for the pair, making them the most expensive fish I had ever purchased. I considered them a symbol of victory, a way of reclaiming what had been taken from me. Around this same time, the property rights advocacy group I had been volunteering with asked me to speak at a statewide conference about HOA reform. The conference was held in Raleigh and attracted legislators, attorneys, homeowners, and HOA board members interested in improving how community associations operate. I gave a presentation about my experience, walking through the timeline of events from discovering my drained pond to Patricia's criminal conviction. I emphasized the importance of property rights, due process, and the need for HOAs to operate within their legal authority. The presentation was well received, and several state legislators approached me afterward to discuss potential reforms to North Carolina's HOA laws. One legislator, Representative Michael Torres, was particularly interested. "Your case highlights serious gaps in our laws," he told me. "HOAs have tremendous power over people's property, but there is not enough oversight or accountability. I am working on legislation that would create a state-level HOA oversight board and provide better dispute resolution mechanisms for homeowners." "That sounds exactly like what is needed," I said. "Too many HOAs abuse their power because there are no real consequences." Representative Torres asked if I would be willing to testify before a legislative committee studying HOA reform. I agreed immediately. A few months later, I found myself in the state capitol building, telling my story to a room full of legislators. The testimony seemed to have an impact. Several committee members expressed outrage at what had happened to me and agreed that stronger protections were needed. The proposed legislation moved forward, though I knew from watching the process that it would take time to become law. Back at home, life settled into a comfortable routine. My pond was now better than ever, featured in several local magazines about water gardens and sustainable landscaping. I gave tours to school groups and gardening clubs, teaching people about pond ecosystems and water quality management. I also started a blog documenting my pond restoration journey and sharing information about dealing with HOA issues. The blog gained a modest following, and I received regular emails from readers asking for advice or sharing their own stories. 2 years after Patricia drained my pond, Representative Torres called to tell me that his HOA reform bill had passed the state legislature and been signed into law by the governor. The new law created stronger protections for homeowners, required HOAs to follow specific due process procedures before taking enforcement actions, and established penalties for HOAs that exceeded their authority. "Your testimony was crucial in getting this passed," Representative Torres told me. "Your story showed legislators the real-world consequences of HOA abuse. You should be proud." I was proud. What started as a disaster had turned into something positive that would help protect countless other homeowners from similar experiences. The Pine Valley HOA continued to operate smoothly under responsible leadership. Robert served as president for 2 years before stepping down, satisfied that he had helped reform the organization. His successor, a retired teacher named Margaret, continued the same balanced approach. I maintained good relationships with my neighbors, even as some of the original residents moved away and new families moved in. The story of Patricia and the pond became something of a neighborhood legend, told to new residents as a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting property rights. My fish collection grew to include over 400 specimens, worth well over $100,000 in total value. I had learned from my previous mistake and obtained specialized aquaculture insurance that would cover the full replacement value of my stock in case of another disaster. I also upgraded my security systems, installing high-definition cameras with night vision covering every angle of my property. The footage was backed up to cloud storage, ensuring that if anyone ever tried something similar again, I would have ironclad evidence, not that I expected any problems. The new HOA leadership was respectful and professional. They occasionally asked my permission to access my property for maintenance on the common fence line or to retrieve errant basketballs from neighborhood kids. I always said yes to reasonable requests, and they always respected my property boundaries. 3 years after the incident, I was approached by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to include my story in a film about HOA overreach in America. I agreed to participate, and the resulting documentary aired on a streaming platform the following year. It brought renewed attention to HOA reform issues and generated discussions across the country about the need for better regulations. The documentary also brought some unexpected attention. I started receiving interview requests from podcasts, news programs, and magazines. I did some of them, always focusing on the importance of knowing your property rights and standing up against abuse of authority. Through all of this, my pond remained the centerpiece of my property and my life. I spent countless hours sitting by the water, feeding the fish, maintaining the ecosystem, and simply enjoying the peace it brought me. The trauma of seeing it destroyed had faded, replaced by pride in what I had rebuilt and protected. I sometimes thought about Patricia and wondered if she had learned anything from the experience. Had she reflected on her actions and recognized how wrong she was? Or did she still see herself as the victim, someone who was just trying to do her job and got punished for it? I would never know, and ultimately it did not matter. What mattered was that justice had been served and that my property rights had been protected. The story had a ripple effect beyond just my personal situation. Several other homeowners in North Carolina successfully fought back against HOA overreach, citing my case as precedent. Attorneys specializing in property rights started including information about my case in their marketing materials. HOA board members attended training sessions where my story was used as an example of what not to do. Even the landscaping company owner, Frank, learned from his mistakes. I ran into him at a hardware store about 3 years after the incident. He approached me somewhat nervously and apologized for his role in what happened. I should have verified everything before I started that job, he told me. I just took Patricia at her word when she said she had authority. I learned a hard lesson about doing my due diligence. I appreciated the apology. At least you learned from it. That is more than Patricia ever did. Frank nodded. I heard she moved to Florida. Good riddance, if you ask me. As the years passed, my pond became an established fixture of the local landscape. Birdwatchers would sometimes ask permission to observe the herons and egrets that frequented the water. Environmental science classes from the local high school came to study the ecosystem as an example of successful habitat creation. I partnered with the County Extension Office to create an educational program about sustainable water features and backyard wildlife habitats. We held workshops at my property, teaching homeowners how to create their own ponds while avoiding the mistakes I had made with insurance and documentation. The experience had transformed me in unexpected ways. I'd gone from being a private person who just wanted to enjoy his property to becoming an advocate for property rights and HOA reform. I had discovered a passion for helping others navigate similar challenges and for educating people about their legal rights. 5 years after Patricia drained my pond, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on community association management. The conference organizers wanted me to present my story to an audience of HOA board members and property managers as a case study in what happens when associations exceed their authority. I accepted the invitation and flew to Denver for the conference. Standing before a room of several hundred HOA professionals was surreal. These were the people who ran community associations across the country, and I was there to tell them about being victimized by one of their peers. But the audience was receptive. They asked thoughtful questions about how HOAs could better verify their jurisdiction, how to handle properties that were not subject to their authority, and how to prevent board members from acting unilaterally. Many of them approached me afterward to say that my story had given them valuable insights into improving their own operations. That presentation led to more speaking opportunities. I became a regular on the HOA conference circuit, always telling my story but also offering constructive suggestions for how community associations could operate more fairly and effectively. My blog evolved into a full website with resources for homeowners dealing with HOA problems. I created guides on researching property records, understanding HOA governing documents, and finding qualified attorneys. The site received thousands of visitors each month and helped countless people navigate their own disputes. The pond itself continued to be a source of joy and peace. I added more features over the years, including a small waterfall, a bog garden with carnivorous plants, and underwater lighting that made nighttime viewing spectacular. The koi grew to impressive sizes, with several specimens exceeding 30 inches in length. I started breeding some of my koi, selling the offspring to other enthusiasts. It became a small side business that covered the costs of maintaining the pond and funding my advocacy work. The breeding program also gave me a deep connection to the life cycle of the pond, watching new generations of fish grow and thrive in the ecosystem I had created. 6 years after the incident, I received a call from Detective Williams, who had investigated the criminal case against Patricia. She was retiring from the Henderson County Sheriff's Department and wanted to meet for coffee. We met at a cafe in Asheville and talked about how the case had impacted both of us. For her, it had been an eye-opening experience about the problems with HOA governance and the lack of accountability for abusive board members. "Your case changed how I look at these disputes," she told me. "I used to think HOA complaints were just petty neighbor squabbles. Now I understand they can involve serious property rights violations and criminal conduct. I've been training newer deputies to take these cases seriously." I thanked her for taking my case seriously from the beginning. "You could have dismissed it as a civil matter and told me to handle it through the courts. Instead, you investigated thoroughly and helped ensure Patricia faced real consequences." Detective Williams smiled. "Justice was served, and that is what matters. I am glad I could help." As I drove home that day, I reflected on how far things had come since that terrible morning when I discovered my drained pond. What could have destroyed me financially and emotionally had instead become a catalyst for positive change. I had not only recovered from the damage, but had built something better and had helped others along the way. My property had become a sanctuary, not just for me but for the wildlife that thrived there and for the people who visited to learn about pond ecosystems and property rights. The destruction Patricia caused had been transformed into creation, growth, and education. 7 years after the pond was drained, the HOA reform legislation that Representative Torres had championed was being used regularly by homeowners across North Carolina to protect themselves against overreaching associations. The law had been amended and strengthened based on real-world experience, creating one of the strongest sets of homeowner protections in the country. Other states started looking at North Carolina's law as a model for their own reforms. I was invited to speak to legislative committees in Virginia, Tennessee, and South Carolina about our experience and the importance of strong property protections. The work felt meaningful and important. Every time I helped a homeowner stand up to an abusive HOA or educated someone about their property rights, I felt like I was honoring the struggle I had gone through. I was turning my negative experience into positive change for others. My pond remained the heart of everything. It was where I started each day with morning coffee, watching the fish wake up and begin their daily routines. It was where I ended each evening, sitting on the dock as the sun set behind the mountains, listening to the bullfrogs and watching the bats swoop down to catch insects over the water. The ecosystem had reached a mature balance. The fish populations were stable, the plants grew vigorously but not overgrown, and the water quality remained excellent with minimal intervention. It was a testament to the resilience of nature and the value of patience in allowing complex systems to develop. I sometimes brought first dates to see the pond, and it became a good test of compatibility. Women who appreciated the beauty and understood the work involved were worth pursuing. Those who saw it as just a muddy hole in the ground were not. I eventually met someone who loved the pond as much as I did, and we started building a relationship with the water as our backdrop. 8 years after Patricia drained my pond, I received an email from someone unexpected. It was from Patricia's ex-husband, Mark Wembley. They had divorced 2 years after the criminal case, and he wanted to apologize for what his ex-wife had done. "I always thought she was too aggressive with the HOA stuff," he wrote, "but I did not realize how far she had gone until the criminal charges. What she did to you was wrong, and I am sorry I did not try harder to stop her at the time. I hope you have recovered from the damage she caused." I appreciated the apology, even though Mark had not been directly involved. It was a reminder that Patricia's actions had consequences beyond just me. Her criminal conviction and the resulting stress had apparently contributed to the end of her marriage and caused problems throughout her life. I wrote back thanking Mark for reaching out and confirming that I had indeed recovered and moved forward. I did not hold any animosity toward him, and I hoped he was doing well. It felt like closing a final chapter on that difficult period. As the years continued to pass, my pond story became less about the destruction and more about the recovery and growth that followed. When people asked me about it, I focused on the positive aspects, how I had turned a disaster into an opportunity to advocate for others and create something beautiful. The pond attracted more wildlife each year as the ecosystem matured. I documented over 40 species of birds that used the pond, from common robins and cardinals to rarer species like green herons and belted kingfishers. The turtle population exploded, with at least 20 individuals of various species making the pond their home. I installed a trail camera to capture nighttime visitors and was delighted to discover raccoons, deer, foxes, and even a black bear that occasionally stopped by for a drink. The pond had become exactly what I hoped it would be, a thriving ecosystem that supported diverse wildlife while providing me with endless enjoyment. As I sat on my dock one evening, nearly 9 years after the draining, I realized that I would not change anything about what happened. Yes, the initial destruction was terrible and traumatic. Yes, Patricia's actions were illegal and wrong. But everything that followed, the legal battle, the advocacy work, the connections with other homeowners, the reforms to HOA law, all of it had been worthwhile. I had found purpose in fighting back and helping others. I had created something more beautiful than what existed before. I had learned about resilience, both my own and nature's ability to recover from disaster. The experience had shaped me into someone stronger and more aware of the importance of protecting individual rights against institutional overreach. My fish swam peacefully below me, including descendants of some of the original stock I had saved in buckets that terrible morning. They represented continuity and survival, a living reminder that even after the worst destruction, life finds a way to persist and thrive. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The surface of my pond reflected the colors, creating a mirror of the sunset that rippled gently in the evening breeze. Bullfrogs began their evening chorus, joined by crickets and katydids in the surrounding vegetation. I thought about Patricia sometimes, wondering where she was and whether she ever reflected on what she had done. But mostly I thought about the future, about the continuing work of HOA reform, about the homeowners I could still help, and about the ecosystem I would continue to nurture and protect. The pond had become more than just a water feature or a collection of expensive fish. It was a symbol of resistance against unjust authority, a testament to the importance of standing up for what was right, and a reminder that even the worst disasters could be transformed into opportunities for growth and positive change. As darkness fell and the stars began to appear, I fed the koi their evening meal, watching them surge to the surface in a swirl of color and motion. They were healthy, thriving, and beautiful. My property was secure, my rights were protected, and I had helped create a system that would protect others from similar abuse. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and life had moved forward in the best possible way. The pond that Patricia drained in an act of petty tyranny had been restored and improved, standing as a permanent reminder that property rights matter, that individuals can successfully fight back against institutional abuse, and that nature's resilience mirrors our own capacity to recover from even the most devastating setbacks. Everything had come full circle, and I stood there by the water I had fought so hard to protect, knowing that it was all worth it.